The millionaire was the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded it without effort. His wealth preceded him, his reputation built on sharp deals, luxury cars, and a string of ventures that expanded his empire. To the world, he was an example of success, an image of what hard work and ambition could achieve. But behind the polished exterior and carefully rehearsed smile, he lived a double life. His arrogance fueled the illusion that he could balance both worlds, one where he was the devoted husband and soon-to-be father, and another where he indulged in his hunger for passion and adventure with a woman who wasn't his wife. He had become an expert at compartmentalizing, crafting lies so perfectly that even he sometimes believed them. Yet beneath the golden mask, cracks were already forming. At home, his wife carried his child, her body and spirit weighed down by the burden of pregnancy and emotional neglect. She was everything a man could wish for, graceful, kind, and deeply loyal. She carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that often went unnoticed but never wavered. Despite the loneliness, despite the late nights waiting for him to return, she chose to hold onto the belief that her marriage still had meaning. She longed for his presence, his touch, his words of reassurance. But instead, she was left with empty promises and a cold bed. Even in her most vulnerable state, she maintained dignity, never lashing out, never allowing herself to break down where others could see. The people around them thought of her as the picture-perfect wife, radiant with the glow of motherhood, unaware that her heart was silently breaking. The mistress, however, knew none of these quiet sacrifices. She was glamorous, always adorned in designer dresses, her laughter echoing in high-end restaurants and on sunlit decks of private yachts. Manipulative by nature, she understood the power she held over the millionaire, feeding his ego and encouraging his reckless indulgence. She didn't care about loyalty or love. What mattered to her was the luxury, the thrill of being desired, and the envy she saw in other women's eyes. For her, the affair was a game, and she was winning. Their chosen escape was a luxury resort by the sea, where the waves kissed the shore with an elegance that mirrored their wealth. The resort sparkled with opulence, white sands, infinity pools, and golden sunsets. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. But beneath the perfect facade, hidden among the clinking of champagne glasses and stolen embraces, was the truth of a marriage unraveling, one that no amount of money or luxury could disguise. She woke every morning to the echo of silence, a silence that wrapped around her like a cold sheet. The house was large, filled with every luxury imaginable, yet it felt emptier than ever. The millionaire's wife, pregnant and carrying his child, found herself drifting through days that seemed longer than nights. The loneliness pressed heavily on her chest, and the weight of her condition was not just physical but emotional. Each flutter of the baby inside her reminded her of the life she was bringing into the world, a life that should have been celebrated with warmth, affection, and shared joy. Instead, she carried it almost entirely alone, while the man who should have been her anchor was slipping further away. The neglect was not always loud, not always cruel, but it was constant. He returned home late, often smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his own. His phone never left his side, buzzing with late-night calls that ended in hushed tones and excuses. There were business trips announced last minute, trips that stretched on longer than necessary. She noticed the details, the tailored suits prepared for destinations that didn't require such attire, the sudden disinterest in family dinners, the distraction in his eyes when she spoke. She didn't need proof laid out in front of her. The subtle signs were enough to confirm what her heart already feared. What cut deeper than the infidelity itself was the humiliation she endured. At gatherings, he dismissed her presence, often directing his charm toward other women in the room, leaving her standing alone, pregnant and overlooked. Friends whispered, offering her sympathetic glances that made her cheeks burn. In public, she maintained composure, but inside she was crumbling. She longed not for riches or grand gestures but for simple respect, for the feeling of being cherished. She yearned for a touch of reassurance, a moment of vulnerability from him, an acknowledgement that she was more than just a figure in his perfect life. Her love had once been enough to blind her to his flaws, but now the veil was lifting. In the quiet hours of the night, when she lay awake with a hand resting over her swelling stomach, she began to reflect on her own worth. She realized that her loyalty had been met with disregard, and her patience mistaken for weakness. The child inside her deserved more than a broken family, more than a mother consumed by sadness and a father lost to vanity. It was in these moments of despair that the first sparks of strength began to ignite. She started reaching out to old contacts. People she once worked with before marriage had confined her to the shadow of her husband's empire. Business associates admired her intelligence and grace, offering her encouragement to step back into the world she had left behind. These conversations became her lifeline, a reminder that she was more than the neglected wife of a powerful man. She was capable, intelligent, and strong. Though she wasn't ready to confront him yet, the seeds of her independence were quietly taking root. She no longer waited by the window for him to return. Instead, she poured her energy into rebuilding her own identity. For the first time in years, she envisioned a life not defined by his choices but by her own. She still carried the pain of his betrayal, but buried within that pain was the beginning of her dignity's return. It was a silent struggle, one no one could see, but it was shaping her into someone even she had yet to recognize. The millionaire believed he had perfected the art of deception. To him, the vacation with his mistress was not a betrayal but a deserved indulgence, a reward for the empire he had built. He whisked her away on a private jet, the leather seats gleaming under soft cabin lights, champagne flowing as they laughed high above the clouds. When they landed, a chauffeur-driven car carried them to a world reserved only for the wealthy, an exclusive island resort where crystal blue waters kissed the white sands, and yachts bigger than mansions floated lazily in the harbor. For the mistress, it was a dream come true. For the millionaire, it was proof of his superiority. Every day began with excess. Breakfast served on private balconies overlooking the ocean, sunlight sparkling against silver trays of caviar, tropical fruits, and champagne flutes. Afternoons were spent aboard his yacht, where he showed off his fortune by taking her diving in hidden coves, snapping photos of her against the backdrop of infinity seas. Evenings melted into nights filled with luxury shopping trips, designer boutiques opening their doors after hours just for them. He showered her with diamonds, handbags, and silk gowns, as if possessions could tether her to him forever. The mistress thrived on it all, the stares from strangers, the envious whispers of hotel guests, the thrill of being spoiled beyond imagination. In his arrogance, the millionaire never once imagined his wife would suspect. He believed she was too naive, too consumed by her pregnancy to notice the pattern of lies. He convinced himself she would never dare question him, and even if she did, he would charm his way out of it as he always had. He thought of himself as untouchable, a man above consequences, his double life neatly concealed by money and power. His arrogance grew with every sip of champagne, every night spent in another woman's arms. But the mistress was not as complacent as he assumed. With every gift, with every whispered promise, her ambition swelled. She began to picture a future not as the secret lover, but as the woman on his arm in public. She wanted the title, the recognition, the power that came with being Mrs. Millionaire. No longer satisfied with being hidden away in resorts and private villas, she dropped subtle hints, questions about when he would leave his wife, what it would take for them to be together openly. She knew how to play her part, stroking his ego, making him feel desired, while planting seeds of her own agenda. Yet, for all his careful planning, the millionaire made careless mistakes. He posed for photos with her, not thinking twice about the staff who watched or the guests who whispered. A couple of tourists recognized him from business magazines and murmured among themselves about his companion. Hotel employees gossiped about the glamorous pair, their words spreading like wildfire in the small luxury community. It didn't take long for those whispers to find their way back across the ocean. Friends of friends mentioned sightings, and rumors began to swirl, reaching ears that would eventually deliver them to his wife. He had underestimated the world's eyes, forgotten that even the richest man could not buy absolute privacy. In his quest to live without restraint, he left behind a trail of evidence, careless glances, lingering touches, and the arrogance of believing that no one would dare question him. What he saw as an escape was, in truth, the beginning of his unraveling. The mistress basked in the glow of borrowed luxury, plotting her ascent, while the wife he abandoned was slowly gathering the pieces of a strength that would one day stand against him. He laughed over champagne, blind to the storm quietly forming on the horizon. The CEO entered her life like a steady tide, not overwhelming, not forceful, but powerful in his quiet presence. He was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, not through arrogance but through the way he carried himself, with confidence built on years of hard work and integrity. His reputation stretched far beyond boardrooms. He was known not just as a sharp businessman but as a leader who inspired loyalty. Handsome in a way that was both striking and understated, he had a calm authority that drew people toward him. His words carried weight, his gaze carried depth, and his actions always matched the image he projected. He and the millionaire's wife shared a history, one that had been buried beneath years of her marriage. Before she had stepped into the gilded cage of her husband's world, she had been an ambitious professional, and it was during that time she had crossed paths with the CEO. They had once worked together on a project, colleagues who admired each other's intellect and dedication. Though life had pulled them in different directions, fate had a way of weaving threads back together. When she began to quietly rebuild her connections, he was one of the first to extend his hand, reminding her that her talents had not been forgotten. The CEO admired her deeply, but not in the shallow way her husband once had. He saw beyond her beauty, beyond her graceful composure. What he respected most was her resilience, her ability to endure pain without losing her dignity, her strength to carry herself with grace despite the loneliness she bore. Where others saw a neglected wife, he saw a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. In their conversations, he listened intently, offering not just business advice but genuine encouragement. Every word he spoke seemed to push her closer to rediscovering her worth. There was a tension between them, a subtle current that neither could ignore. It wasn't inappropriate, nor was it something they gave into. It was simply there, lingering in the way their eyes sometimes lingered too long, in the pauses between words heavy with unspoken meaning. She felt it in the way he respected her boundaries, never crossing lines, yet making it clear that he valued her more than anyone had in years. He felt it in the quiet admiration that grew each time he saw her stand a little taller, reclaim a little more of herself. Though she carried his child, though her marriage still tied her to the millionaire, her heart could not help but respond to the gentleness she found in the CEO's presence. It was not a love story yet, but it was the beginning of something that had the power to grow. For now, it was simply a bond, built on trust, respect, and the undeniable pull of two people who recognized strength in one another. The night of the gala unfolded like a scene from a dream, but for the pregnant wife, it was something far more powerful than just an evening of glitter and lights. It was her quiet reclamation of self. She had been hesitant to attend at first, knowing her condition made her feel vulnerable, but the CEO had insisted she belonged there. With his support, she stepped into the grand ballroom, her hand gently brushing against the curve of her belly as she held her head high. The room fell into a hush for a moment when she entered. Clad in a flowing silk gown that accentuated her grace rather than concealed her pregnancy, she radiated a beauty that went beyond appearance. Her glow was not simply maternal, it was the glow of a woman who carried herself with dignity despite the storms around her. The CEO, sharp in his tailored suit, stood beside her like a guardian, their partnership evident in the way he offered her his arm, steady and unwavering. The contrast was stark. While her husband was far away on a beach, flaunting his mistress, she was here, commanding admiration in the most dignified way possible. The whispers began almost immediately. Some marveled at her elegance, noting how rare it was for a woman in her condition to step into such a public arena with such poise. Others leaned closer to their companions, curious about her relationship with the powerful CEO by her side. They had seen him alone at countless events, always reserved, always focused on business, and now here he was escorting the wife of a millionaire. The sight sparked speculation, but instead of ridicule or scandal, the whispers carried admiration. To them, she was not a woman abandoned but a woman rising. Throughout the evening, she held conversations with ease, her intellect shining as brightly as the diamond she wore. Old colleagues and acquaintances were reminded of the woman she used to be before she was overshadowed by her husband's wealth and ego. They saw in her the grace of someone who refused to crumble, and in their eyes she found something she had been starved of for so long: respect. The CEO stayed close but never overstepped, allowing her to shine in her own right, stepping in only when she needed steadying or when he sensed fatigue pulling at her. His presence was supportive, not possessive, a stark contrast to the arrogance her husband once displayed in public. As the night went on, the wife felt a shift deep within herself. The attention she received was not for her husband's status, not for the fortune she was tied to, but for who she was as a woman. People admired her strength, her intelligence, her grace under pressure. For years she had been made to feel invisible, treated as though her worth was tied only to the role she played in her husband's world. Yet here, among the glittering lights and golden chandeliers, she realized she was seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It was an emotional turning point she hadn't expected. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that value was not something her husband could grant or take away. It existed within her, recognized now by people who mattered, and reinforced by the quiet respect in the CEO's gaze. While her husband wasted his nights chasing vanity, she was finding herself again, discovering that admiration rooted in respect and dignity was worth more than any fleeting attention. That night, as she left the gala, her heart carried a new truth. She was no longer just the neglected wife of a powerful man, she was a woman of her own power, ready to stand tall in whatever came next. The millionaire was lounging on the deck of his yacht when the moment arrived, the sea stretching endlessly before him, champagne chilled in a silver bucket by his side. The mistress was laughing, draped in a designer bikini and oversized sunglasses, her voice carrying above the crash of waves. He scrolled through his phone absent-mindedly, expecting messages from business associates or updates about his latest investments. Instead, a headline caught his eye, a society column, bold and impossible to ignore. His wife's name was there, printed in sharp black letters, paired with the CEO's. At first, he thought it was a mistake. But then he saw the photos. His wife, radiant in her silk gown, walking arm in arm with the CEO at the gala. The images captured her grace, her beauty, the way her presence seemed to command the room even while visibly pregnant. She looked powerful, admired, respected. The CEO by her side was every bit the picture of strength and sophistication, his hand resting lightly on her back as though shielding her from the world. The crowd around them seemed to lean closer, drawn by their combined presence. The millionaire's jaw tightened. Anger burned in his chest, hot and unrelenting. How dare she? How dare his wife step out in public, and with another man no less? His arrogance twisted the truth into betrayal, though deep down he knew the photographs showed nothing more than companionship and support. Still, the sight was intolerable to him. The world was seeing her not as the quiet, neglected wife he kept in the background, but as a woman who could stand proudly beside another powerful man. It wounded his pride in a way no business loss ever could. He felt disbelief next, shaking his head as though the images would vanish if he blinked hard enough. She had always been loyal, always waiting for him no matter how late he returned, no matter how cold he grew. In his mind, she was incapable of stepping into the spotlight without him. The thought that she might have grown strong without his approval unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The irony, of course, was lost on him. He sat there surrounded by indulgence, a mistress by his side, her hand sliding over his arm as she asked what was wrong. He had spent weeks flaunting his infidelity across beaches and boutiques, parading a woman who wasn't his wife through luxury resorts. Yet the thought of his pregnant wife being photographed with another man filled him with rage. He condemned her silently, branding her actions as betrayal, even as he ignored the truth of his own sins. But in the end, it wasn't love that drove his fury, it was ego. His heart remained untouched, for he had long stopped valuing his wife's presence. What stung was the blow to his pride. The image of her shining in another man's company, receiving the admiration he once thought belonged only to him, was unbearable. It wasn't the wife he mourned in that moment. It was the reflection of himself that she had so effortlessly shattered. The millionaire paced the length of his luxury suite, phone clutched tightly in his hand, fury pulsing through every step. The photos of his wife with the CEO burned in his mind, a humiliation he couldn't bear. His mistress lounged nearby, pretending to read a glossy magazine but watching him carefully from behind her sunglasses. With one deep breath, he pressed call, his jaw set and his tone sharp as soon as she answered. "You think I wouldn't find out?" he snapped, his voice echoing against the marble walls. Parading yourself in public with another man, and while you're pregnant with my child. Do you have no shame? On the other end of the line, the wife was quiet at first. 4 years, she had endured his tone, the harshness in his words, the way he twisted the truth until she felt guilty for sins she hadn't committed. But something inside her had changed. She straightened her back as she held the phone, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Her voice, when it came, was steady. No shame, she repeated softly. You dare to speak of shame while you're vacationing with your mistress? While you've left your family behind to chase pleasure? Her words cut through him sharper than any accusation he had expected. For the first time, she wasn't silent, wasn't swallowing her pain. Instead, she held a mirror to his hypocrisy. He faltered for a moment but quickly recovered, anger fueling his denial. Don't twist this back on me, he barked. You're my wife. You belong at home, not on the arm of another man, not feeding gossip columns with scandal. And what about you? She shot back, her voice rising now. How many scandals have you created with your affairs? How many whispers have you ignored while I sat alone, humiliated, pretending nothing was wrong? I will not be shamed for finding respect where you refused to give it. The mistress, who had been eavesdropping all along, lowered her magazine, her eyes narrowing. The venom in the wife's words struck her as much as it did him. For weeks, she had reveled in the idea of being the center of his world, convinced the wife was weak and invisible. Now, hearing her speak with such conviction, she felt threatened. You should hang up, the mistress hissed, stepping closer. She's just trying to manipulate you. Don't let her ruin what we have. But her interjection only fueled the tension. The millionaire, caught between two women, felt his grip on control slipping. His wife's defiance rattled him, the mistress's jealousy pressed at him, and for the first time, he realized he was no longer the one dictating the narrative. His voice cracked with desperation as he tried to regain control. You're making a mistake, he told his wife, softer now but edged with menace. Don't forget who I am. Don't forget what I've given you. Her reply was calm, almost chilling. What you've given me is loneliness, humiliation, and betrayal. I won't forget that. The line went silent for a moment before she ended the call, leaving him staring at his reflection in the glass doors of the suite. Behind him, the mistress crossed her arms, seething. She's not afraid of you anymore, she said coldly. And if she isn't afraid, neither am I. The triangle had shifted. His wife had found her voice, the mistress her jealousy, and he, once untouchable, was suddenly standing on crumbling ground. The empire of lies he built was beginning to spiral out of his control, and for the first time, the millionaire felt the sting of fear. The CEO had watched from the sidelines long enough. He had seen the way whispers followed the millionaire's wife at the gala, how people speculated with both admiration and curiosity. He had also heard the rumors of the millionaire's vacation, the mistress by his side, the arrogance with which he flaunted his betrayal. When the confrontation finally came, it was not behind closed doors but in the professional world, where appearances mattered most. At a high-stakes business meeting, both men found themselves across the same table. Investors, journalists, and board members gathered to hear updates on ventures that could shift markets. The wife had quietly stepped into the meeting as well, representing her growing involvement in projects the CEO had helped her reclaim. She sat with composure, not beside her husband but as an independent voice in the room. The contrast was striking, the millionaire, red-eyed and restless from nights of indulgence, and the CEO, calm, precise, and commanding. When the millionaire attempted to undermine his wife with a dismissive comment, the CEO intervened without hesitation. His voice was firm, steady, and impossible to ignore. She deserves respect, he said, his gaze fixed on the millionaire. Not as your wife, not as a symbol, but as a capable woman in her own right. If you can't recognize that, others will. The room went still, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. The wife lowered her eyes for a moment, gratitude flickering across her face. The millionaire bristled, his pride wounded. You think you can stand there and lecture me? This is my life, my family, my business. None of this concerns you. But the CEO didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his tone sharper now. It concerns everyone when you drag others down with your arrogance. You've disrespected your wife, and by extension, the people who admire her strength. You've flaunted betrayal and expect the world to applaud. That isn't leadership, it's weakness. Murmurs rippled through the room. For years, the millionaire had relied on fear and status to command loyalty, but in this moment, the tide shifted. The CEO's defense wasn't loud or theatrical, but it carried conviction, and conviction was something people trusted. Investors glanced at one another, already calculating where their confidence truly lay. The wife, silent yet strong, embodied dignity, while her husband looked increasingly small, cornered by his own missteps. The confrontation was more than just words, it was a public transfer of power. The millionaire, once untouchable, felt his grip loosen as respect shifted toward the CEO. By openly defending the wife, the CEO didn't just shield her, he exposed the cracks in the millionaire's authority for all to see. It was the beginning of the end for one man and the rise of another, a moment that would be remembered as the day the balance of power began to change. The mistress had grown weary of waiting. At first, the luxury was enough, the yachts, the jewelry, the endless parade of designer clothes. But beneath the glitter, she was still only the second choice, hidden in shadows while the wife's name remained untarnished in public. Every time the millionaire promised he would handle things soon, resentment gnawed deeper at her. She hadn't traded her youth and pride just to remain a secret. She wanted more: status, power, and recognition. So she began to scheme. With a careful smile, she played the part of the devoted companion, but behind closed doors she started gathering pieces of information. Financial slips he left unattended, whispered phone calls about deals that skirted legality, drunken confessions that slipped from his lips after too many glasses of scotch. She kept everything, knowing one day it would be her weapon. That day came sooner than even she expected. A journalist, hungry for a scandal, became her ally. Through encrypted messages and late-night calls, she leaked private details. The extravagant trips billed to company accounts, the questionable transfers, the careless arrogance with which he handled his fortune. She gave them more: stories of his cruelty, photographs snapped discreetly during their vacation, and hints of corruption that tied back to his empire. The press devoured it. Headlines exploded across media outlets. Millionaire's secret life exposed. Lavish vacations funded by company money. Whispers of infidelity and scandal. The world that once admired him now turned against him. Investors pulled out, charities distanced themselves, and former allies refused to take his calls. Overnight, he went from admired tycoon to cautionary tale, his reputation collapsing faster than he could contain the damage. His mistress watched it all with satisfaction, though she knew she couldn't emerge unscathed. But her goal had never been loyalty, it was survival. She made sure her role was hidden, ensuring the scandal pointed squarely at him. Meanwhile, the wife remained untouched by the chaos. She refused to give interviews, refused to indulge the reporters who camped outside her home, desperate for a statement. She carried herself with quiet dignity, neither confirming nor denying, letting the storm swirl around her without being dragged in. Her silence became her shield, and ironically, it earned her more respect than any words could. People saw her as the wronged woman, a figure of grace in the face of betrayal, a contrast to her husband's arrogance and his mistress's ambition. The millionaire, once untouchable, now found himself mocked in the very circles that used to bow at his presence. He raged in private, blaming everyone but himself, never realizing that the woman he had placed on a pedestal of luxury had been the one to strike the final blow. The mistress walked away with her own kind of victory, and the wife, without lifting a finger, emerged stronger, her silence speaking louder than the millionaire's desperate attempts to salvage his name. She had watched everything unfold like a storm crashing against the shore, her husband's empire unraveling, his mistress striking the fatal blow, the press circling like vultures. For months she had carried the weight of loneliness and humiliation, but now the world was beginning to see what she had endured in silence. And yet, despite the scandal, despite the whispers urging her to take revenge, she found herself at a crossroads. The question was no longer about him, it was about her. In the quiet of her home, with one hand resting on her growing belly, she reflected on the years she had given. She had stood by him through victories and failures, through boardrooms and banquets, through moments when his eyes had shone with ambition, and others when they had grown cold with neglect. Now she saw clearly that loyalty had been a one-sided vow, and she no longer owed him the devotion he had squandered. The defining choice before her was not whether to forgive him, nor whether to punish him, it was whether to reclaim her life. The CEO had shown her glimpses of what respect felt like, genuine admiration, not control disguised as affection. But she also knew that her future could not simply be built on another man's strength. She had her own voice, her own vision, and for too long it had been muted by the shadow of her husband's arrogance. As the scandal deepened and the world turned its back on him, doors began to open for her. Business offers, invitations, partnerships that were once withheld simply because she was the millionaire's wife. Now, she was free to step forward as herself. When the press cornered her, expecting anger or confession, she finally spoke, her voice calm but unwavering. "My focus is my child and my future. The rest is behind me." With those words, she made her choice, not to be defined by betrayal, but by resilience. She would not sink into bitterness, nor would she allow herself to be shackled to his downfall. Instead, she walked a new path, one forged not by scandal but by strength. The millionaire had lost everything, the mistress had moved on, but the wife, once silent and overlooked, had chosen dignity, independence, and a future built on her own terms. It was the choice that redefined her, not as someone's wife or someone's victim, but as her own person. The storm between them had been building for months, but when the final confrontation came, it was not behind closed doors, it was under the harsh gaze of the public. The millionaire, desperate to salvage what little remained of his pride, demanded a meeting. He could not bear the humiliation of seeing his wife elevated by whispers of admiration while he became the subject of scandal. His reputation was collapsing, his empire was on shaky ground, and he thought that by confronting her, by reclaiming authority, he could somehow remind the world that he was still in control. She agreed to meet him, but not alone. The setting was neutral yet symbolic, a grand hotel lounge, once a place where he had flaunted his wealth and status. Now, it served as the battlefield for the truth. She entered with quiet grace, her pregnancy more visible now, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. At her side was the CEO, not as her savior, but as a reminder that she was not without allies anymore. For the first time, the millionaire was forced to see her not as a possession, but as a woman who had grown beyond his control. He launched into accusations, his voice filled with venom. How could she humiliate him by being seen with another man? Did she not understand what people were saying? His words dripped with hypocrisy, conveniently forgetting his mistress, his scandals, and the empire of lies he had built. But she didn't flinch. Her silence unnerved him more than any shouting could. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and devastating. "You cared more about appearances than our marriage. More about control than love. And now, you care more about your pride than your child." The words hit him harder than any accusation the press had published. For the first time, he faltered, realizing that he had lost not only her loyalty but also the image of power he had clung to. The CEO stepped forward, his presence commanding but not domineering. "She deserves respect. She deserves freedom. And if you cannot give it, then step aside, because the world no longer revolves around your ego." The tension in the room thickened. For a moment, it seemed as if the millionaire might lash out, his fists clenching, his jaw tight with rage. But the cameras waiting outside, the journalists hungry for another headline, and the weight of his crumbling empire froze him in place. He had lost the upper hand. He had lost his audience. What followed was not the dramatic outburst he had planned, but his quiet collapse. The mistress's betrayal had stripped him of allies, the press had torn apart his reputation, and now his wife's steady defiance left him hollow. He was a man exposed, no longer the untouchable tycoon but a broken figure facing the consequences of his choices. The wife did not gloat, nor did she cry. She simply stood, dignity intact, and walked away. The CEO followed, not as a conqueror but as a companion. The The millionaire remained behind, slumped in his chair, a man staring into the ruins of the empire he once thought indestructible. The final showdown was not marked by shouting or violence, but by something far more powerful: the silence of a woman who no longer feared him and the presence of a man who reminded him that respect, once lost, could never be reclaimed. The story did not end in the ruins of the millionaire's pride. It began again in the quiet steps of the woman who had endured so much. After the final confrontation, she returned to her life with a sense of clarity she had not felt in years. No longer bound by the chains of loyalty to a man who had squandered her devotion, she embraced her future with calm determination. What once felt like weakness, her silence, her patience, her endurance, had transformed into strength, for it gave her the power to walk away without hatred consuming her heart. She poured her energy into her work, her ventures, and above all, the child she carried. Invitations came, not because of her husband's name, but because of her own growing influence. The CEO, still by her side, supported her endeavors with respect, never overshadowing her. Their bond deepened, not rushed, but built on trust and mutual admiration. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as a wife in someone's shadow, but as a woman in her own right. The public, too, noticed the transformation. Where once she was pitted as the betrayed spouse, she became admired as a symbol of resilience. Articles no longer described her as the millionaire's wife, but as a leader in her own ventures, a figure of quiet power. The whispers that once stung her in ballrooms and banquets had turned into praise. She carried herself with dignity, people said. She rose above scandal. In reclaiming her dignity, she had reshaped the narrative entirely. The millionaire, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. His businesses suffered without the trust of investors, his name became associated with betrayal and excess, and the mistress who once flaunted herself at his side had long disappeared, leaving him with nothing but memories of the empire he thought would last forever. The world moved on without him, as it always does when arrogance blinds a man to reality. His downfall was no longer newsworthy, it was history, a warning, a shadow of what once was. For her, however, life was only beginning. On a sunlit morning, she held her newborn in her arms, a tiny heartbeat against her chest, and felt a peace that luxury had never given her. This was her true wealth: the love she carried forward, the strength she had cultivated, the independence she had claimed. The CEO visited often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care, and the possibility of love lingered like the horizon after a storm, calm and promising. She understood now that betrayal had not destroyed her, it had freed her. The cracks in her marriage had exposed not her weakness, but his. The humiliation she once endured had paved the way for her rise. And the silence she once kept had become her greatest weapon, for in the end, she had spoken not with rage but with action. As the waves crashed softly against the shore outside her window, she thought of the resort where it had all begun, where he had once flaunted his mistress under the same sun. How strange, she realized, that the sea could hold both ruin and renewal. For him, it had been the backdrop of downfall. For her, it symbolized rebirth. The story closed not with revenge, nor with bitterness, but with a woman stepping into a new dawn, dignified, resilient, and finally free.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.